Okay, so have you ever been listening to your favorite electronic track and thought, wait, can I make something like this?
It can seem kind of like magic, right? All those cool sounds, the driving beats.
Totally. But that's what's so amazing about electronic music production these days. It's
Yeah.
way more accessible.
Even if you're starting completely from scratch.
Exactly. And this complete guide to electronic music production we're diving into, it's like the perfect roadmap.
Like your passport to that world, yeah.
And it actually made me think about those early pioneers like Kraftwerk. Imagine creating electronic music back in the 70s with these massive synthesizers.
They were huge. Those things took up, entire rooms.
Can you imagine the dedication?
It's incredible. And you can see how much they influenced what we hear today. I mean, everything from, the electro sounds of Africa Bambaataa to even, the synth pop of Depeche Mode.
It all goes back to those early innovators.
It does.
So this guide, it really breaks down how to build your own setup. It doesn't seem as daunting as I thought.
No, they make it very approachable, even getting into the nitty-gritty of mastering your tracks and everything.
Okay, so first things first, you got to have a decent computer. I always wondered, how important are the tech specs really?
It's a super common question. Think of it this way. Your computer, it's basically your studio now.
That's true.
And the guide talks about, CPU and RAM, which I know can sound kind of techy.
Totally. What do those even mean when you're talking about making music?
Right. So the CPU, that's the central processing unit, basically the brain of your computer. And a faster CPU means it can handle more at once. So let's say you're using tons of effects, virtual instruments, a really good CPU, like maybe an Intel Core i7 or an AMD Ryzen 7.
Okay.
That'll prevent your computer from lagging or crashing, which is super frustrating.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like when you try to run a marathon with a sprained ankle.
Yeah.
Versus being in top shape. But then there's RAM. I could never wrap my head around that.
Yeah, think of RAM like your desk space. The more RAM you have, the more you can spread out your work and do things simultaneously. And with electronic music, you're often layering a ton of different sounds and effects.
So 16 gigs of RAM is ideal because if you have less RAM, then you're more likely to experience those frustrating lags and crashes, right?
Exactly, especially as your project gets more and more complicated. You don't want to hit a wall.
Okay, so more RAM equals a smoother workflow. Got it. But even with a supercomputer, you need the right software, right, to actually make the music. That's where the DAW comes in.
Exactly. And picking a DAW, that's your digital audio workstation, that's a big decision. It's where you're going to spend most of your time producing, so you want it to feel right for you.
And it can be kind of overwhelming at first because there's just so many options out there.
You're not wrong, yeah. But luckily, this guide, it does a great job at breaking down the pros and cons of, the big ones.
It's a huge help, especially for beginners.
Totally.
So in a nutshell, what are some of the key differences between all these different DAWs?
Well, each one has its own strengths, workflows. For example, someone just starting out who's maybe excited about experimenting and even performing their music live.
Mm-hmm.
Ableton Live, with its session view, that could be a great fit. It's known for being super flexible for triggering and looping different musical ideas on the fly.
Oh, that's cool. So it's like having a digital band at your fingertips.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have something like Logic Pro X, which is known for being really user-friendly.
Okay.
It's a little more linear in how it approaches things, which can be good for beginners who don't want to be overwhelmed.
Right.
Plus, it comes with a ton of really great instruments and effects already built in.
So maybe Logic Pro X is a good starting point for someone who's maybe a bit intimidated by all the bells and whistles.
Absolutely. And then there's FL Studio, which is super popular for beat making in particular.
Right.
And it's got this really intuitive workflow that's based on patterns, so it's great for creating those catchy rhythms.
Okay, cool.
That makes it really fun to use too.
I'm sensing a theme here. There's really no one-size-fits-all, is there? When it comes to DAWs, that is.
Exactly. And the best part, most of them offer free trials.
Oh, nice.
So you can test them out, see what their workflow feels like without having to commit right away.
Okay, so we're building our studio. We've got the computer. We've explored different DLUs. But what about the actual sounds?
You mean those iconic electronic textures, timbres, all that?
Exactly. That's got to be the synths, right?
You got it. And this guide takes us on a cool little trip, actually, through the whole evolution of synths.
Oh, cool.
From those massive machines that used to take up entire rooms.
I've seen pictures. They're the size of cars.
To the software synths we have today. It's pretty wild how much things have changed.
It really is. What were some of the limitations, like back in the day, with those huge things?
Well, for one, they were crazy expensive, not easy to get your hands on at all.
Right.
And then maintaining them was a whole other beast. Plus, they could be super unpredictable.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. But you know what's interesting? Those limitations, sometimes they actually led to creative breakthroughs.
Because you had to work with what you had, right?
Exactly. Artists had to get resourceful, experimenting with different ways of connecting modules to get unique sounds.
So those limitations kind of pushed the boundaries of what was possible.
For sure. And that whole spirit of experimentation, it's still at the core of electronic music today, even with all the tech advancements.
That makes sense. So today we've got virtual instruments, which means anyone can have access to like this insane range of sounds.
Right on your laptop.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's mind-blowing. And this guide, it dives into the different synthesis methods like subtractive, additive, FM synthesis, wavetable. I'll be honest, some of these I don't really get.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
Could you break down like what makes each method unique?
Absolutely. So subtractive synthesis, that's one of the most common ones. Think of it like, imagine a block of marble and you're a sculptor.
Okay, I like this.
You start with something whole, and then you chip away at it to reveal the shape inside.
Okay.
So you're starting with a sound that's full of different frequencies, and you're using filters to subtract certain ones, shape it into something new.
So it's like you're filtering out the unwanted parts to sculpt the sound you do want.
Precisely. Now, additive synthesis, it's like the flip side of that. Instead of subtracting, you're building, starting with silence, and then you add together these simple waveforms to create more complex sounds.
So instead of chipping away, you're building it up piece by piece.
Exactly. And then you've got FM synthesis, frequency modulation synthesis. This is where it gets a bit more,
intense.
Yeah, a little. Basically, you're using one waveform to modulate the frequency of another one.
Modulate, meaning like change it over time.
Yeah, and that creates these like really bright or metallic sounds. Think about those classic 80s synth sounds. A lot of those were FM synthesis.
Oh, cool. Okay, so FM is all about that modulation magic. But what about wavetable synthesis? The guide mentioned something about using tables of waveforms. What does that even mean?
So picture this. You're scrolling through Instagram filters, right? Each one changes the look of the image.
Right.
Wavetable synthesis is similar. You're essentially manipulating waveforms to alter the sound. Like you have a table full of different waveforms and you can scroll through them, blend them, and change them in real time. You can create some crazy, dynamic, evolving sounds that way.
Wow, so it's like having a whole library of different textures just there at your fingertips?
Pretty much.
The possibilities are endless.
They really are.
But with all these different synthesis methods and then, you know, virtual instruments on top of that,
yeah,
it can feel overwhelming. Are there any that are like good for beginners to start with?
Yeah.
Just to get their feet wet?
Totally. The guide mentions a couple Serum and Vital, and these are great because they're super powerful, professional grade even, but they're also free.
Free is always good.
For sure. They got tons of presets and tutorials so you can jump right in and start experimenting.
Okay, awesome. So let's say I'm feeling inspired. I've got my DIW. I'm messing around with some synths, making cool sounds. How do I actually like capture those ideas and turn them into something bigger? Okay, so let's say we've got all these cool sounds, these loops and synth lines, and I'm feeling super inspired. But how do I actually go from that to like a full track? That's the part I always get lost in. Where do you even begin?
Yeah, it's kind of like having all the ingredients for an amazing meal, but no recipe, you know?
Exactly.
That's where arranging comes in.
So it's more than just putting things in order, right?
Right. It's about creating a journey for the listener, taking them somewhere.
Totally. But electronic music doesn't always follow those traditional song structures, does it? Like, you know, verse, chorus, verse, chorus.
You're right. It doesn't always. A pop song might stick to that formula, but electronic music, it can be a bit more...
unpredictable.
Yeah, exactly. It plays with your expectations a little bit. But that doesn't mean there's no structure at all.
Okay.
This guide emphasizes that even in electronic music, you're still creating a flow, you know?
Okay.
A sense of buildup and release to keep people hooked.
So it's still about creating those moments, like the tension and release, even if it's not as straightforward as like a verse and a chorus.
Exactly. Think about some of your favorite electronic tracks. There are those moments where the energy keeps building and building.
Right, right.
Maybe they add more synths, more percussion, and then it hits that peak, that drop.
Yes.
Where everything kind of explodes, and then it pulls back again, creates that space, you know?
It keeps you guessing.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so exciting. It's all about that dynamic listening experience.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like the difference between a flat line and a heartbeat. You need those rises and falls.
100%.
Okay, but once you've arranged everything, then comes mixing, which always seems kind of like this mystical art to me.
It can feel that way for sure, but it's really about making sure all those sounds you've created, they work together.
Yeah.
A good mix, it can completely change a track.
So what are some of the things to focus on, especially with electronic music? When you're mixing, I mean.
So the guide talks about EQ, compression, reverb, and delay. Those are like your sonic tools.
Okay, I've heard of all those, but break it down for me. Like EQ, that's for adjusting the tone, right?
Yeah.
But I always get lost with all the frequencies and stuff.
Think of EQ as a sculpting tool. You can use it to boost certain frequencies, maybe make something sound brighter, or cut frequencies to make it cleaner, get rid of muddiness. Like, let's say your bass is too boomy.
Right.
You can use EQ to pull back some of those low frequencies, and suddenly it's tighter, punchier, like in a techno track, you know?
So it's about finding that balance, that clarity.
Exactly.
What about compression? That one always trips me up. I know it's about making things louder, but...
It is about volume, but think of it as like a dynamic leveler.
Okay.
It evens out the volume of a sound. So the quiet parts get a little boost and any harsh peaks get smoothed out. Super useful for drums, makes them sound really powerful.
Okay, so it tames the wild ones and brings up the quiet ones.
Exactly.
What about reverb and delay? Those seem pretty straightforward. You're adding like space and echo, right?
You got it. Reverb is all about making something sound like it's in a specific place, like a cathedral or even just a small room. Delay that creates those cool repeating echoes. Even using them subtly can add a lot of depth to your mix.
It's amazing how much goes into it. It's a whole art form. But there's one final step, right? Mastering.
Can't forget mastering. That's the final polish, getting your track ready for the world to hear it.
So what happens in mastering? Is it just making it as loud as possible?
That's a common misconception, actually. Yeah, loudness is part of it, but it's more about balance. Making sure your track sounds good on any system.
Oh, okay.
Think about listening on your phone speakers versus a huge sound system at a club. They sound totally different.
They do.
A mastering engineer makes sure your track translates across all those different environments.
So it's about consistency as much as anything.
100%. They use tools like EQ, compression again, limiting to fine-tune everything, get that balance just right, not too quiet, not too loud, and it gives it that really professional sheen.
So it's a pretty delicate process then.
It definitely is. A good mastering engineer has like a trained ear and can make these tiny adjustments that make a huge difference.
Wow. It's so cool to get a peek behind the curtain like this,
Yeah.
to see all the work and artistry that goes into creating this music.
Absolutely. And the best part is you don't need to be a tech whiz to make electronic music.
Right.
With a bit of curiosity and the right tools, anyone can dive in and explore.
That's awesome. So for our listeners who are feeling inspired to start their own sonic journey, what advice would you give them?
Don't be afraid to just start experimenting. Download a free DIW, play around with some virtual instruments, and most importantly, just have fun with it. You never know what you might create. And remember, every single producer out there, they all started as beginners.
That's right. Everyone starts somewhere.
Exactly.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. I had a blast.